I'm James N. Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University, and this is Brazil Unfiltered. Today we have a great interview with labor lawyer and activist Stan Gacek. I've known Stanley for many years. He and I formed the Brazil Strategy Network in 2003 to show support for Brazil. He's an important member of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil and has a long history of fighting for progressive labor issues in the United States and Brazil. He is currently the senior advisor for global strategies at the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union. Previously, he was the deputy and interim director of the International Labor Organization mission in Brazil, the special counsel for the international labor law for the Solidarity Center of the AFL-CIO, and the associate director of the International Department of the AFL-CIO, among other positions. In addition to being on the forefront of many of the international labor issues involving Brazil, Stanley is also a friend of the former president and current presidential candidate, Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva. Now, before we get to the interview, I'd like to quickly ask those of you who can to please support us at patreon.com/Brazil Unfiltered. All the proceeds go to the workers, my producers who make this program possible. Now let's go to the interview. Hey, Stan, thank you for coming and welcome to Brazil Unfiltered. Let's jump right in. Can you describe your current relationship with Brazil?
Yes, Jim, thank you very much for the invitation. Aqui é grande prazer estar contigo. You've been a friend and comrade of many years. Yes, I'm currently involved with Brazil in many aspects, including in terms of international labor solidarity, in terms of looking for opportunities to strengthen our respective movements in North America and Brazil in terms of labor, but I am following all things Brazilian as much as I can at this point. And like you, Jim, I've had a lifetime of solidarity with Brazil, which actually dates back to 1981.
So let's ask that question. How did you how'd you end up specializing in Brazil, getting interested in Brazil? What brought you to Brazil?
Well, I'd had actually, in terms of my childhood, a fascination with Brazil. There's nothing in my background, which is Brazilian, Lusophone, or Latin American in any sense. But I'd always been fascinated by the scale of Brazil, the fact that it was this continental power in our hemisphere, which had many similarities to the United States in terms of a European colonial past, slavery, a formal but not complete emancipation of slavery, a history, a great sad history, and still an atrocious history of repression and genocide of indigenous peoples. Also, all the European immigration, but with results, with developments which are very, very different. A lot of similarities and a lot of differences. So that fascinated me, Brazil, since I was a child, and also, to be very honest, even though it may sound a bit capricious, the whole influence as a child in the 1960s, the influence of Brazilian music, in particular bossa nova, in terms of American culture, American jazz, was a real cultural attraction for me. But in the late 70s, I was following these massive strikes that were being led in the auto and metal sector of Greater Sao Paulo, being led by a trade union leader by the name of Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva. I was following this closely, had a great interest in it. I was working at that time as a lawyer, as the assistant general counsel in my union, which I've come back to now, the United Food and Commercial Workers, whereas I serve basically as the international relations director. But in 1980, I was attending chats, bate-papos, that were being given by someone you know very well, Maria Helena Moreira Alves, academic who had been studying and then completed her dissertation and converted her dissertation to a publication in the 1980s. But she was in a sense an ambassador for the Brazilian Workers' Party without portfolio in 1980, 1981, and she would give talks and conversations at the Washington office of the United Auto Workers. And I attended those meetings, those chats, And Maria Elena said, "We are expecting." This was in early 1981, that the military dictatorship is going to bring the whole weight down on Lula and the other leadership of the great metal workers and auto workers strike of Greater ABC in 1980, which occurred in 1980.
So the ABC, for our listeners, is the three cities that surround São Paulo: Santo André, São Bernardo, and São Caetano, which are centers of industrialization. Many of them have plants and metalworking subsidiary companies that supply the auto industry. So it's the kind of the center of the industrial powerhouse of Brazil in the state of São Paulo and the city of São Paulo. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jim. And again, it's considered that region to be kind of the birthplace of the Novo Sindicalismo, New Unionism, which Lula was emblematic of that in terms of his leadership, which in terms of workers following their interests, basically they represented, because of their expression of real freedom of association, collective bargaining rights, exercising those by wanting to have direct negotiation with the big automakers. They were challenging the Brazilian corporatist system of labor relations, which was highly mediated and intervened by the labor judiciary, granting too paltry of wage awards. The workers wanted to go beyond that, and they did, and Lula led that effort. But it also represented, as you know very well, Jim, it represented an existential threat to the military regime as well, because it was upsetting the established power structure. So Maria Elena had said that we're probably going to be a trial under the national security law, that we're going to be needing solidarity from the global labor movement. And to abbreviate the story, in February of 1981, I was part of a small delegation. I was there from my union. I got leave from my union, from the legal department, to attend this step, to be on this delegation, along with the late John Christensen, the International Relations Director for the United Auto Workers, and a sister and a brother from the German labor movement. Actually, was a young man who was in the International Relations Department of the DGB of the Labor Central for Germany, then West Germany, and a woman who was an advisor to a German Social Democratic member of the Bundestag of the West German legislature, parliament. We were the delegation for Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva and the other metal workers who had been charged and predictably convicted under the national security law.
So just to jump in there, just so to understand, so Lula was charged with violating the National Security Act. This is still during the dictatorship. The dictatorship
Correct.
will only be ousted in 1985. And is it because of the strike of 1980 that he's charged with violating the National Security Act? What are the bases for that accusation?
Yeah, it had to do. I mean, Lula had been thrown into detention and been arrested in 1979 as well for the very massive strike in 1979. You know, the big strike actually started in Saab-Scania plants of the Swedish producer in 1978. That involved many other automakers. But 1980 was seen as the proverbial straw by the military regime, and then they brought basically the full force of prosecution of the national security law at that time, and for violation of an article, which was translated from the Portuguese, a violation for collective disobedience of the laws. And what that meant was that Lula's leadership of a strike, which went beyond what the labor courts had awarded as a compulsory arbitration award, which was much less than what the workers wanted or deserved, that by extending that strike, there had been a collective disobedience of the laws and a violation, therefore, of the national security law. And there was a trial which was set in February of 1981. Luiz Greenhalgh very well known Brazilian lawyer and jurist, and also became a leader within the Brazilian Workers' Party. He was the lead attorney. They effectively boycotted the proceedings because they knew that it was going to be stacked up against Lula. Interestingly enough, that was Lula eventually prevailed on appeal in 1982. But even though Lula had been convicted and was there, we as a Solidarity delegation there in Sao Paulo, we had the opportunity of accompanying Lula. He was out on his own recognizance following the conviction and pending the appeal in February of 1981. And I saw the great power that Lula had in terms of galvanizing masses, not just the metal workers, but the greater community in Sao Bernardo, with several rallies and comicios, gave several radio interviews. We were there. It was a great privilege for me. I would call it was my epiphany, because I saw actually the beginning of the new unionism, but also the new democratic movement, which one of its expressions, of course, was the Workers' Party, Partido dos Trabalhadores, which had been officially convoked, founded in 1980, as you know.
And so the two of us were in Sao Paulo together. We didn't know each other then. We only would cross paths 2 decades later. But Stan, what was Lula like as an individual when you interacted with him? What was his personal comportment? How was he as he interacted with people?
With Lula, what you saw is what you got. He has been, obviously, being a very, very skilled leader, a charismatic leader, skilled politician, the president of the Federative Republic of Brazil. He's, of course, not going to be disclosing everything to everyone, including close friends, but he is someone who is very, very transparent, someone who speaks his mind, someone who thinks before he speaks. And my own, just the many, many personal conversations that I've had with him, he deliberates, he thinks, he gives very honest responses. Obviously, he has an innate sense of humor, which is incredible. But he has great warmth. He exudes that warmth and charisma, of course, in public settings, but also does so on a one-on-one basis. I'm very proud to consider him my friend. I've been there a long time. Lula also has great loyalty for those who have been with him for many years, and I've appreciated that. And for that reason, I've had the privilege of being able to meet with him throughout the years since 1981, when he came to the United States, when I was in Brazil. And I most recently met with him in February of 2020 in Brasilia. And that, of course, was shortly before the lockdown, the quarantine, basically the whole embargo on international travel, which took place in March of 2020, and which we're coping with now.
And we'll get back to that in a few minutes when we hear about your visiting of Lula when he was in prison and afterward, and your impressions of that. So, the international community, the labor movement, and others tried to draw attention to his case in 1981. Do you think it made a difference? Was it an important part of the process of eventually his getting a release from these charges on an appeal?
Yes, very, very much, folks. Very much so. It was a galvanizing moment in terms of all of us who were involved in international labor solidarity at the time, in the early 1980s. And Lula's leadership of those massive strikes in 1978, 79, and 80, his natural eloquence, that impressed the international trade union community. Most notably, sister metal workers unions throughout the world. There's great solidarity coming from the German metal workers, the Nordic metal workers in the Scandinavian countries, particularly the Swedish metal workers union. But of course, there was that solidarity from the metal sector in the United States, and particularly from the United Auto Workers. But Lula was seen as a major figure. There was actually it was Margolis who was writing for the New York Times at the time, And he actually he used the term of Lula being the Lech Walesa of Brazil. He wrote an article which was which was around the time of his trial in February of 1981. It was very, very interesting, is that many analogies were made with regard to Walesa's leadership in Poland, and having then to confront, of course, a martial law regime, and Lula having to confront a military dictatorship regime as well in Brazil. And just one other vignette very quickly, and I'll stop. Something that was very interesting is that I also had the great privilege and honor to be the only American unionist to speak in the founding Congress of the Central Única dos Trabalhadores, the single central of workers, which definitely represented an outcome of the new unionism. That founding Congress was in São Bernardo in August of 1983, and organically linked through leadership, not structurally, but through leaderships and common leaderships with the Brazilian Workers' Party, with the PT, but it was not exclusively, of course, with the Brazilian Workers' Party, which is a very, very important historical point, and many people get confused about that. But I recall at that founding Congress that there were banners for Solidarność there, as well as many militant leftist trade unionist banners throughout the hall for the founding Congress, which is an interesting point. There was an identification with the movement in Poland against a military communist regime of General Jaruzelski and the opposition to the military dictatorship in Brazil.
Stan, in 1964, unfortunately, sectors of the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations supported the military takeover. And in the United States over the 70s, there was a real transformation in the labor movement in the United States. How is it that the labor movement ended up being in favor of those forces that were against the military that had come to power in 1964? What went on in the labor movement in the United States to see that shift in attitudes towards Brazil?
I will give a short answer and then attempt to provide a more fulsome answer, but not to take up a lot of time. Basically, it was a perception. What prevailed and should have prevailed is that there was a perception in the U.S. labor movement eventually that what was the new unionism, what the new unionism aspired to in Brazil, and attempting to really achieve genuine freedom of association and collective bargaining power in what had been a system, a corporatist labor relations system, with overly mediated by the state and the powers that be through a labor judiciary, but that movement, which was aspiring to real authentic collective bargaining and real authentic union organization, had everything to do with the DNA of the American labor movement. And I think that position clearly prevailed by the late 1990s. I certainly, in a humble way, I had a part with that, as I was from 1997 on, I was in charge of the AFL-CIO's policy with the Americas, which included Brazil, and so there was clearly a shift. But I do think that basically the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the former communist bloc, all of these changes basically made that these sort of positions which the AFL-CIO's Institute for Latin America, namely the American Institute for Free Labor Development, which was supporting the more pro-corporatist elements of the labor movement in Brazil. Basically, the conditions, the conjuncture, and the realization that what Brazil represented in terms of genuine worker power and union power overcame basically all of that former and unfortunate collaboration by some elements who claimed to be speaking for the whole U.S. labor movement at that time, and that included AFL, included the Institute. I won't go into a lot of detail, but since I was not employed by the AFL-CIO, but by the United Food and Commercial Workers, I had a certain freedom and bandwidth to express more of an independent view. But I would say it much to, at times to the umbrage of then the executive director of the American Institute for Free Labor Development, and ironically, because they were supporting more of the pro-corporatist elements within the Brazilian labor movement, which had leadership that was linked with the Brazilian Communist Party. As you know, Jim, as you know, as a historian, you know that history very well. That was the great irony. But in Brazilian terms, they were representing, that element of the labor movement was representing the more conservative, pro-corporatist elements within the labor movement, with those labor leaders aligned with the PT, with Lula being, the great example of that, were representing a new unionism, which really was aspiring to the banners of freedom of association and authentic collective bargaining.
So Lula runs for president in '89, is not successful. He runs in 1994 against Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a sociologist and a politician. Runs again in 1998, is unsuccessful. And then in 2002, on the fourth try, he becomes elected president of Brazil. What was his presidency like in general terms for you? How do you assess the 8 years that he was in power and what that meant for Brazil?
I mean, overall, a great success, in a word. And we basically have seen the turn downward, basically since the effective parliamentary coup against Dilma Rousseff in 2016 with the impeachment process. But Lula truly squared the circle, and accomplished which many thought would be a mission impossible, but was able to do it, and was able to do it, I think, without sacrificing the ideals of democratic socialism, which I think inspired really the creation, the formation, and the continuation of the Brazilian Workers' Party, the Partido dos Trabalhadores. And Mimi Keck, in her brilliant book about the history of the Brazilian Workers' Party, and published in 1991, she basically said that the notion of socialism was more of an inspiration, was an aspiration, was an ethical aspiration, rather than any kind of highly elaborate plan of public policies, and certainly, heaven forbid, anything akin at all to a state command policy model of the failed communist bloc. And so I do think that Lula was still able to basically to be true to those ideals, but in the words of the great American socialist Michael Harrington, he accomplished, or tried to accomplish, the left wing of the possible. And I think he did that. I think he did that quite well within the 8 years. Basically squaring the circle by, at the beginning of his administration, winning the confidence of international financial markets and the international financial community, who were all betting that Lula was going to be spendthrift, would push for interest rates to sharply fall in Brazil, and would be creating a whole economic crisis and engendering an instability for the investment community. He completely beat the odds on that and surprised much of the world, to some consternation of the left initially with that. But he also pursued effective reduction of social inequality through measures which were did not challenge all that deeply relations of production, or challenge economic elites in Brazil, but clearly empowered the Brazilian working class and the Brazilian poor. And as we well know, basically everything which was involved around Bolsa Familia and expanding Bolsa Familia, and also everything that was achieved through Hunger Zero, Fome Zero program, which Lula was dedicated to very personally, to make sure that all Brazilians, would have 3 square meals a day. Much of that was accomplished. Not to mention a shift in macroeconomic policy, which actually led to great expansion of industrial capacity in Brazil, and over his 8 years, added well over 20 million new jobs in Brazil. So he squared the circle. There are those on the left who criticize his measures, not being ambitious enough, maybe being too orthodox, but it succeeded. It succeeded. One other point, and I'll close. One thing that was very telling for me is what he was saying in 2002 during his campaign. To basically win the support of Brazilian industry or Brazilian national bourgeoisie. I mean, he did that. It was very, very critical in order to being able to prevail in Brazil by saying there is something wrong in this country when interest rates are fully exceeding and outstripping the rate of earnings and profit for productive industries in Brazil. And it was no accident that he selected it as a vice presidential candidate. Alencar, José Alencar, who basically had been a textile magnate, an industrialist. That was a clear signal. It was a clear signal to the business community that he really wanted to restore a productive capitalism as opposed to overly determined finance and speculative capitalism in Brazil. But to do so, but also to try to push forward a democratization of the economy through more distribution, through transfer programs, through Bolsa Familia, and by expanding opportunities for Brazilian masses, whether it was through ProUni, which were university opportunities. But I will say this: Lula brought a democratization to governance by actually ramping up tripartite, basically workers, government, and employers engagement and involvement in all kinds of forums and national forums and public policy governing bodies. He ramped that up to a degree which was unprecedented in Brazilian history, which really showed a dedication to what I would say is a democratic socialist ideal, but attempting to democratize the society and the economy as much as possible.
So why then did Lula get thrown in jail? A great question, I think about, but I will get to the point. We basically know that lawfare was waged against Lula. And now as what is coming out in terms of all these bogus convictions and indictments essentially being annulled and overturned through the judicial system, finally and justly, is proof itself that basically there was an effort to weaponize and use the legal system against Lula, despite false claims, false actions, with absolutely no base and evidence, and totally violating every aspect of due process. In other words, the case for Lula livre, or free Lula, becoming Lula inocente, or Lula the innocent, which Lula himself would say personally to me, and when I visited him in prison, which was in 2019, in May of 2019, he said, this is what really needs to be, because
I have absolutely no culpability in terms of all this action being brought against me. That is all turned around. But what was the motivation for it? Again, this is probably not real objective lawyering or going, looking at particular all the facts, but clearly there was a conjuncture, a correlation of forces and a coincidence, which clearly showed that there were forces that did not want Lula to be reelected in 2018, and he would have won. He would have won, but for his being disqualified. By the way, even under the Ficha Limpa law, or the clean ballot or clean slate law, which Lula, interestingly enough, had signed into law during his second administration in 2010, there is a provision within that law, Article 26C, which Brazilian Workers' Party and their lawyers had certainly were proclaiming and pointing out should have been used, which basically says that even if someone had had their criminal conviction sustained in the first level of appeal, which was the case of Lula with regard to the absolutely ridiculous and contradictory sentence which Sergio Moro and the Lava Jato operation engineered for undetermined official acts of corruption. Undetermined means you have no evidence. Official means you were president, but Lula was no longer president when he supposedly was receiving this quid pro quo, which he never received because he had no title to this property, received nothing of material benefit. And so, I mean, on the sentence on its face was totally ridiculous and was totally Kafkaesque. But unfortunately, that's what Lula was convicted of, and really showed that there was an operation. But anyway, getting back to the clean slate or clean ballot law, that provision of the law basically says that if a defendant, criminal defendant, had even though the conviction was sustained in the first instance of appeal, as it was in Lula's case, can have their disqualification for running suspended if they would have plausibility of prevailing on the merits of their case. Lula had beyond plausibility of prevailing on the merits. So anyway, he should have been the Supreme Electoral Court in Brazil on that basis should have allowed him to run in 2018. But all the forces were aligned against that. And to get back to the point, why were the elites so frightened? I mean, this is really a complex question. In many ways, Lula was a great success for Brazil. Brazilian agribusiness thrived. Brazilian banks thrived. Much of the working class and the poor working class were brought into the middle class because of demand-driven growth. It was successful. Lula's administration was successful for everyone. But I think that elites, including multinational elites, were seeing that this basically demand-driven, more equitable, socially inclusive model is just too much, and really offended certain class prejudices, very strong class prejudice on the part of elites. Now, this sounds, very anecdotal and not very exact, but I do believe that there are academics who've done studies on this in terms of interviews with Brazilians, including members of the Brazilian elite. The fact that Lula's measures and continued by President Dilma were basically empowered domestic workers, faxineiras, to be able to take airline trips because they could afford it, was seen as a great affront to a very, very classist society in Brazil. I think those things should not be dismissed. I think that even though Lula was successful and actually brought success to Brazilian elites, the Brazilian elites ultimately did not want to bear this any longer. And that there were also interests internationally that didn't want to see the success story continue.
What was it like to visit Lula in prison?
I found Lula when I did visit him, and I was accompanied by then the president of the CUT, Wagner Freitas, who's now a vice president of the CUT, Sergio Nobri of the ABC Metal Workers was elected the president to succeed Wagner. Wagner had been on the bank workers side of the CUT, but Lula looked very, very energetic. He was there. We were with him in his cell there in what had been the Polícia Federal building in Curitiba, which is converted. That was converted into a federal prison. And certainly, even though being denied his ambulatory freedom, he showed himself to be highly energetic. I thought he looked in very good health. He had lost some weight, but not in an unhealthy way, anyway. And he was operating in all cylinders at that time. It was if nothing had changed, and he was thinking. He was thinking creatively, extrapolating about what needed to be done in order to restore the democratic progressive tendency, which he represented in Brazil, as did President Dilma. And it was a great honor and a pleasure to talk with him. But Lula, in his typical way, basically said, Stan, I want you to get together with our lawyers and with CUT leadership, and we need to think things through in terms of our overall strategy, in terms of Lula Inocente, but also in terms of really attempting to vitalize solidarity with Brazil, international solidarity with Brazil. So it was that I want you to, Stan, when you're going back to the States, I want you to have a meeting in Sao Paulo with these leaders, and let's move things forward. And I did, and I have, and those conversations, particularly with Lula's core legal team, continue.
Stan, Lula is ahead in the polls at this point, 20 or 25 points ahead of Bolsonaro. The third way, the center-right people who have broken with Bolsonaro and are showing their independence are lingering in the polls with very small percentage support. If things continue as they're continuing now, Lula might be the next president of Brazil. What do you think his third term will be like? How do you see him governing?
I mean, the challenges are unprecedented. I mean, the most obvious that come to mind are the state of the pandemic, and having to deal with what has been public health disaster in Brazil and the world. Although, in spite of Bolsonaro, in spite of a chaotic and a repressive, and I would say in many aspects a certain criminal regime within Brazil, in spite of all that, fortunately, state and local authorities have been able to get vaccines out, and in spite of Bolsonaro, the public health system has been working to expand vaccinations in Brazil. Thank God. But Lula will have an incredible task. There's been a lot of retrogression in terms of social inclusion on the labor front, which I follow so closely, in terms of basically collective bargaining and union power having been dismembered, starting with a radically neoliberal labor law reform during the Temer administration in 2017, and then being exacerbated by policies of the Bolsonaro regime, and all of the regress with regard to child labor, forced labor, combating forced labor, child labor, and advancing decent work. That is going to be a very, very tall order. But I would have every confidence that Lula's leadership, as he was able to do from 2003 through 2011, that he will bring parties together. He will revive social dialogue, which he had ramped up in order to really develop public policies in a direction and a recovery, which is going to have real, more popular buy-in and integration of Brazilian society. I expect that he will do that. I think that it will have to, much of what he was able to accomplish and with President Dilma were able to accomplish will need to be rethought and will need to be refitted. But I'm not just saying this because I'm his friend. I think that given the success of those policies in terms of economic growth and social inclusion, these in the pandemic era and what we will hope will be the post-pandemic era, these will need to be refitted, strengthened, and readapted in the Brazilian context. And I think he would be, I think he is the right man, the most opportune leader in order to do that.
Do you think Biden might meet with him before he's elected president?
I certainly would hope so. There are those of us in the solidarity community and those of us of allies of Lula. We'll try to do what we can to help that. But certainly the U.S. administration will be, obviously they will have their concerns about doing things appropriately and not attempting to show, undue favor. But certainly, if President Biden is receiving other potential candidates, would certainly, I would think, bolster the argument that he definitely should meet with Lula.
Any last comments to our listeners about your experiences in Brazil, your experiences with Lula, with the Workers' Party, with the labor movement?
Yes, overall, I'll make references to one of my favorite, most influential philosophers and thinkers about your question, Jim. That's Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, of course, this is quoted a lot, and I will be paraphrasing. Said to remember that basically those who are progressives, revolutionaries in his case, need to be pessimistic in the mind but optimistic in the will. I think that applies very, very much to Brazil. And Lula represents, in Gramscian terms also, the perfect organic intellectual. Basically a great thinker, a great leader, not formally schooled in the academic sense, although he has received, of course, very well-deserved diplomas, doctor honoris causa, from many, many universities, including recently in Europe. But I am, if due process is respected, if the institutions are respected in Brazil, if free and fair elections are respected in Brazil, I'm quite confident that Lula will prevail, and I am optimistic about that. And I would basically, and I continue to believe, to paraphrase Stefan Zweig's, very, very clear and famous reference about Brazil, to be a country of the future. It is a country and a power of the present. It was clearly, and that was clearly demonstrated during the Lula and Dilma years. And I think that great potential can be won back and restored when Lula is reelected in 2022.
Thank you, Stan, so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered. It's been wonderful talking to you about the labor movement, your experiences with Lula, your predictions for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for this great privilege. Obrigadão.
Tchau, tchau. Até a próxima.
Até.
I hope you are enjoying the program. If you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. Also tell your friends, colleagues, students, professors, and anyone else you think might be interested about the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.